Hello. So today I'm going to continue reading from The Eye of the Eye, from which nothing is hidden, by David Hawkins. We're up to chapter 5 now, so get yourself comfortable and I'll begin. So chapter 5 is called Circumventing the Ego. Simplicity. The core of all the great spiritual teachings and teachers can be surmised in a few simple paragraphs. Operationally, they all amount to the admonition to avoid that which makes one go weak with muscle testing and pursue that which makes one go strong. Choosing to be easygoing, benign, forgiving, compassionate, and unconditionally loving towards all life in all its expressions, without exception, including oneself. Focus on unselfish service and the giving of love, consideration, and respect to all creatures. Avoid negativity and the desire for worldliness and its greed for pleasure and possessions. Forego opinionating, the judgment of right versus wrong, the vanity of being right, the trap of righteousness. Seek to understand rather than to condemn. Venerate the teachers of these basic principles and ignore all others. Apply these principles to one's view of oneself as well as of others. Trust in the love, mercy, infinite wisdom, and compassion of divinity that sees through all human error, limitation, and frailty. Place faith and trust in the love of God, who is all forgiving, and understand that condemnation and fear of judgment stem from the ego. Like the sun, the love of God shines equally on all. Avoid negative depictions of God as an anthropomorphic error, i.e., jealous, angry, destructive, partial, favouring, vengeful, insecure, vulnerable, contractual, etc. Surrender and sacrifice. These are arbitrary terms that presume that one is looking at spiritual principles from the viewpoint of the ego's vested interests and justifications for negativity. To the ego, spiritual principles represent a possible loss of positionality, but from the viewpoint of spirit, they are gains. The primary surrenders and sacrifices have to do with the substitution of humility for vanity. In actual practice, one merely relinquishes the vanities of opinionating and judgmentalism. The letting go of positionalities undoes the limitation of the error of the polarity of the opposites, which is the dualistic consequence of perception. By letting go of the self-referential term I as a habit of thinking, the hold of the narcissistic core of the ego is lessened. Substitute the habit of expressing ideas as the third person instead of with the subjective pronoun I. The use of impersonal statements about how things seem avoids getting personally embroiled in issues. Dispassionate statements tend to be more balanced and objective because they include many sides of an argument rather than a single-sided, biased view. What one witnesses in the world of human events is neither right nor wrong, but the acting out of the energy fields of consciousness as they impinge and express through particular individuals under specified conditions of time and place. If we avoid the hypothetical positionality that people could be different than they are, we see that, in actuality, people cannot really help being other than they are. If they could be different, they would be. Limitations define possibilities. Limitations define possibilities. The hypothetical does not exist. It is not a reality, but an imagination. It is irrational to condemn human behaviour by comparing it with the hypothetical ideal. Indignation gives way to compassion through understanding and brings into prominence the truth of the great historical statements. They know not what they do, Jesus Christ, or the only sin is that of ignorance, Buddha. Transcending the negatives. It is not very efficient or rewarding to battle sin and get into a struggle to use willpower to overcome defects. These are already positionalities and traps that bind the mind in the dualistic error of the opposites. The way out of conflict is not to try to eliminate the negative, but instead to choose and adopt the positive. To view that one's mission in life is to understand, rather than to judge automatically, resolves moral dilemmas. Professionals do this all the time. Doctors and lawyers will actually even tell their patients and clients that their job is to heal or defend and not to judge. The surgeon operates equally on the broken hip of the saint or the criminal. It is not my position or function to judge in such matters, is a common statement. Much relief is experienced when we realise that by adopting a spiritual life, righteous condemnation and hate that ensues from it can be left to others. This pursuit of the spiritual good benefits all mankind, and it could therefore be said to be the most praiseworthy vocation of all. The spiritual commitment that defines a distinct role that differs from that of the uncommitted person. It implies a different set of standards and focus of energy and attention from the ordinary seeking of the vanities of the ego and worldly accomplishments. One sacrifices material or egocentric gain for spiritual progress, and in doing so, the transient or is subordinated to the permanent, and that which is of true value is chosen over that which is only an illusion. A yardstick that is helpful in making decisions is to project oneself ahead to one's deathbed and ask, which decisions do I want to be accountable for at that time? We know with certainty from spiritual research, which anyone can verify, that consciousness does not miss one single iota of life. All is to be counted and taken responsibility for, and nothing goes unnoticed or unrecorded. This is in general agreement with the totality of man's experience and wisdom throughout all cultures and ages, and is the common theme of all religions and spiritual teachings. In practice, then, one transcends the negative by merely choosing the opposite. With the internal discipline that stems from passionate commitment, the negative choices are no longer seen as options. We all then become conscientious objectors when we draw the line and set boundaries. This rather automatically occurs as a consequence of choosing spiritual goals that we value above the goals of the world. Keeping one's own counsel. Spiritual views are not very popular in society in general. It is not necessary to impose one's views on others. Proselytizing is best done by example rather than by coercion and label grabbing. We influence others by what we are rather than by we influence others by what we are rather than by what we say or have. To express views that are contrary to public opinion may be sociologically praiseworthy, but to do so leads to conflict and enmeshment in the arguments and discord in the world. The pursuit of causes is the role of the social and political reformer, which is an activity different from that of the seeker of enlightenment. Praiseworthy endeavours can be seen as deserving of sympathetic support, but they are also perceptually defined positionalities with intrinsic limitations and agendas. Embroilment in the issues of society is a luxury that the seeker of spiritual enlightenment needs to forego. Each person has their own karma or destiny to fulfill, and it is best not to confuse these missions. The spirituality motivated saints of history did indeed uplift mankind, and such was the nature of their missions and the merit of spiritual courage, which often included even the sacrifice of their physical lives. Collectively, these social saints inspire whole nations and cultures, and thus, by their public lives, silently serve all mankind for generations. The calling of the private life spiritual aspirant is more socially humble, but equally important, and of service to the whole of mankind. The social saint uplifts by external action and example. The devotee uplifts by internal progression. Every increase in the level of consciousness affects the consciousness of all mankind in a manner that is unsung but discernible and demonstrable by spiritual research. The calibrated level of the consciousness of mankind is a composite resultant of everyone's stage of evolution, and the higher calibrated levels are immensely more powerful than the negative ones. The power of love emanated by the consciousness of only a fraction of mankind actually totally counterbalances the negativity of the whole mass of humanity. 78% of the world's population is still in the negative range, below the calibrated level of 200. Only 4% even reaches the level of love, which calibrates at 500. And only 0.4% reaches unconditional love, which calibrates at 540. Therefore, every loving or compassionate thought outweighs many thousands of negative thoughts held by others. We change the world not by what we say or do, but as a consequence of what we have become. Thus, every spiritual aspirant serves the world. Ordinary life. Meaning is defined by context, which determines motive. It is the motive that establishes spiritual value. To dedicate one's actions as a service of love to life is to sanctify them and transform them from self-seeking motives to unselfish gifts. We define excellence as dedication to the highest standards. Every act can then be held as an opportunity to glorify God by sheer purity of endeavour. All physical tasks and labour can be ingredients in one's contribution to the world. Even the smallest tasks can be seen as serving the common good, and if viewed in that light, work becomes ennobled. How life is contextualized can bring either joy or resentment. Begrudging is replaced by generosity. If others benefit from one's efforts, so much the better. Everyone has the opportunity to contribute to harmony and beauty by kindness to others and thereby support the human spirit. That which is freely given to life flows back to us because we are equally part of that life. Like ripples in the water, every gift returns to the giver. What we affirm in others, we actually affirm in ourselves. The exceptional life. To be realistic, one has to take into account that to choose to devote one's life to reaching enlightenment in our society is uncommon and relatively rare. The goal of society in general is to succeed in the world, whereas the goal of enlightenment is to transcend beyond it. It is important to remember that the world operates within the limited Newtonian paradigm of linear causality, which has its prevailing perceptions of what is real. Spirituality, on the other hand, is based on the invisible realities and realms of non-duality, and therefore may seem unreal or, at best, an oddity to the ordinary world. To the hard-headed realist who operates out of material reductionism and measurable, concrete results, the values of the spiritually committed seem vague, ephemeral, and suspect. Therefore, the levels of science and logic, which calibrate at the 400s and dominate our society, view values and motives of those in the levels of the 500s with scepticism and go on to deny any reality at all to the levels above 600. Usually, most people's understanding of spirituality or religion, which they confuse with each other, is that they have to do with right and wrong. Society is generally pervaded by the moralistic opposites of good and bad, which results in the whole panorama of cultural institutions of law, prisons, government, regulations, taxes, bookkeeping, courts, police, military, politics, and war. By contrast, purely spiritual organizations lack authoritarian structure, own no buildings or edifices, have no officers, treasuries, goods or monies, and they avoid expressing any views and remain uninvolved with outside issues. Intrinsically, spiritual organizations make no public statements and operate solely out of voluntary adherence to spiritual principles. Neither do they proselytize, and although they have no employees, they operate out of service. They have no debts, obligations, or investments, and thus the truly spiritual can be said to be in the world but not of it. Spirituality seeks neither credit nor does it accept blame. The best examples of such a group in our current society are the so-called 12-step groups, whose only power derives from their spiritual purity and that have evolved to the point of addressing themselves to a major number of human sufferings. These groups calibrate at 540, which is the level of unconditional love. The exceptional life becomes so by virtue of context and meaning, whereby choice sets up a hierarchy of values that motivates all activities. The difference between the ordinary and the exceptional life is primarily one of context. To value love above gain is already such a major shift of attitude that it transforms life. When people become spiritually inspired and dedicated, their whole life may go through a very major disruption. Many such persons abruptly leave jobs, careers, family, friends, and positions, and frequently go off to seemingly remote places. This major move is often viewed with alarm by family and associates who seek plausible psychological explanations. In the ordinary world, sane people do not just suddenly bolt and leave everything in order to find God. Spiritual aspirants confound the worldly with their willingness to give up everything to follow some invisible inner calling. Because the spiritually orientated person's goals are invisible, it seems to the ordinary world that the person may have gone mad, insane, or is trying to escape reality. Families and friends may also be angry and resentful at the seeming desertion and rejection of the very goals for which the world strives. To leave privilege, money, power and position seems outrageous or even insulting. Many devotees adopt the simple, non-material lifestyle, which again seems to previous associates as deserting responsibility. Spiritual groups. Joining a spiritual group or organization is a personal choice determined by many factors, both present and past. The most important factor to consider is the actual calibration level of consciousness of the group or organisation and its leaders. Classically, the grace of the guru is the inner source of power of specific spiritual teachings, which is in agreement with the calibrated levels of consciousness. Thus, the actual calibrated level of the originator of a teaching and of the teachings themselves are critical. This is a point that cannot be emphasized too strongly. Zealous enthusiasm is no substitute for truth, nor is the belief in the faith of thousands or even millions of followers. Spiritual discernment is a rare gift, and historically speaking, it does not occur until the third eye opens with spiritual vision. Until that happens, any spiritual seeker, no matter how earnest, can be easily fooled. If spiritual imposters were not impressive, charismatic, believable, and convincing, they would have no followers. It actually takes an expert or a person of very advanced consciousness to tell the difference. The reason for this spiritual error is that the error of the false guru is one of context, and the context is beyond the limited perception of the initiate. Erudition is also not a guarantee of truth. There are teachers of great brilliance, but when one does research, one finds that the heart chakra is out of balance. In contrast, very loving teachers who are all heart, but in whom the third eye or crown chakra is out, lead followers down an errant path to possibly the most painful of all human experiences, in which spiritual disillusionment leads to depression and even to suicide. Traditional major religions. The admonition, caveat emptor, applies without exception. Many of the world's great religions originated from primitive nomadic tribes and cultures. Ignorance at the time was very major. Ignorant people tend to be easily swayed and impressed, especially through fear and superstition, and they tend to think in anthropomorphic terms. In those days, cults were rampant. Science was missing, and therefore many events in nature were attributed to supernatural powers. To influence these supernatural powers, amulets, pieces of animals, bones, stones, carved figures, magical sounds and symbols included were earthly locations and phenomena of nature, mountains and volcanoes, along with sacred lands or holy places and ruins. The gods were responsible for major earth disasters and qualities. Famine, floods, earthquakes, eclipses of the sun and positions of the stars were all involved with supernatural significance and magical powers. People worshipped animals and animal spirits. Animism was prevalent. Involved in all this were the spirits. Therefore, manipulating spirits became prevalent. Sacred drugs, charms, spells, trances, incantations and sacrifices were considered to have great value. The angry gods were to be assuaged by self-starvation, flagellation, animal sacrifice, mutilation, playing with dangerous beasts and cobras, lying on beds of nails, mortifications of the flesh, disease-ridden holy poverty, ritual infliction of pain, and the killing of animals, fowl, and virgins. This morass of savagery and ignorance was often the very culture out of which religions arose. Why God could be considered to be pleased by the spilling of animal blood or the death of a maiden cannot be understood unless one realizes that these cultures had created belief and deified that which was the exact opposite of God. These gross distortions of truth arose as projections from the dark side of the ego, and these negative gods were really the gods of the spleen, given to revenge, jealousy, envy, spite, retaliation, condemnation, rage, destruction, punishment, casting souls into hell, and smiting whole civilizations with pestilence, famine, flood, fire, and storm. As a religion arose out of this morass of negativity, it tended to emphasize and focus on the negatives of sin, hell, punishment, and righteousness, and used these as an excuse for all forms of cruelty, war, mutilation, persecution, conviction, burning at the stake, banishment, imprisonment, and the cutting off of hands. All this was believed to be holy, since suffering in all its forms was deified. Therefore, the killing of infidels was lauded and conflict was seen as justified. It could always be rationalized by invoking past cultural injustices, which seemed to justify retribution for many centuries and generations on end. In the grip of this negativity, religion became society's worst oppressor and perpetrator of rampant injustice and cruelty. A culture that lives by the venom of the spleen expects and projects a God that is menacing, cruel, and violent. To misidentify the gods of hell with the God of heaven is such a massive and staggering spiritual error that the extent and gravity of consequences to mankind are almost incomprehensible. The totality and extent of human suffering had at one time earlier in life revealed itself to this consciousness, and the revelation was shocking. In that instant, atheism replaced religion. Belief in a God as creator of such extensive horror and suffering was not comprehensible. Years later came the realization that the error was made by attributing the qualities of the ego to God. In retrospect, it is clear that the atheism was merely the rejection of the false gods of mankind, because there was a prevailing spiritual intuition that held that a real God would be the opposite of that which was preached by religion. That intuition was later confirmed when the emergence and the radiance of divinity within this consciousness obliterated the remnants of any such absurd beliefs. A simple inspection of this scale of consciousness reveals that the historic angry gods calibrate well below 200 and are therefore not in integrity. They are in the direction of falsity rather than the truth. On the scale, God, as seen by the negative energy field, is described as indifferent, vengeful, punitive, condemning, vindictive, and despising, as in God despises all sinners. These are the gods of hate with which mankind has justified its cruelty and barbarism throughout the ages. Surely the history of civilization for at least the last 5,000 years has been that of repetitive horror, which culminated in the last century with the slaughter and mayhem of millions of people. The misidentification of demons as gods has had vast consequences of staggering gravity to mankind. In this historic setting, there were still those of greater spiritual advancement who protested the ways of destruction, but society soon labelled them as the enemy that had to be silenced. In a blind society, a protester who can still see the light is viewed as unpatriotic, or an iconoclast, or psychotic, or a coward, and certainly a threat to the status quo. To not go along with socially current delusions is to be viewed as dangerous and subversive. In history, the rare spiritual devotees who experienced higher states of consciousness or even enlightenment were called mystics and were often branded as heretics and were persecuted, excommunicated, and burned at the stake. Their teachings were threats to the power structures that were based on spiritual error. The rule of guilt, sin, and fear was indeed threatened by a God of infinite mercy compassion, and unconditional love. Until now, it has actually escaped man's discernment that truth brings peace, whereas falsehood brings fear. By that sign, it is possible to tell the difference. In the late 1980s, the consciousness level of mankind finally leapt from 190, where it had been for many centuries, and crossed the crucial and critical level of 200, which is the level of integrity, to its present level of 207. This higher level of consciousness is no longer hospitable to savagery and hate, and most of society, including the churches, no longer emphasizes sin and fear. They speak now of the God of love. The current Pope speaks against killing, execution, and inquisition, and about the failure to defend the innocent and downtrodden. Like springtime, the promise of a new era in man's understanding of God is emerging. Now the level of consciousness of mankind is high enough to be able to recognize the truth of God of love, instead of worshipping the God of guilt and hate. Mankind now stands at the great threshold of real awakening, which may be the actual nature of the second coming of Christ, as foretold in Scripture. Civilization almost reached the point of nuclear self-extermination before it hit bottom and turned again to the light. The subversion of spiritual truth into its opposite can only occur if the consciousness level of mankind is below 200. But it begins to correct itself when the prevailing level of consciousness crosses over the line to truth and integrity at 200. It is only in recent years that mankind has accepted the grace of the discernment of truth from error. The guillotine is no longer a symbol of equality, freedom, and brotherhood, but can now be seen for what it is. Society now encounters new moral dilemmas with the interfacing of the residuals of the old God and the new paradigm of reality. We now have such paradoxes as atheists going to court to establish their God-given right to freedom, as promised by the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, which state that freedoms and rights stem from God's having created all men as equal. At just over the consciousness level of 200, God is seen as the epitome of fairness, equality, and freedom. He has at last become benign and friendly. That heaven is actually attainable now seems a plausible reality as new hope arises out of the bleak despair of mankind's generations of hopelessness. Humanity is in the process of being reborn, and the God of joy is replacing the God of dread and fear. Emergence of the new paradigm of reality. As the level of consciousness of mankind advances, major shifts automatically occur in prevailing attitudes and social styles. The negative becomes progressively less attractive, less acceptable, and less persuasive. Hate, revenge, pridefulness, and self-righteousness find fewer and fewer enthusiasts. Punitive actions are now seen to have very unpleasant consequences. Inequality and injustice become harder to rationalize. Pulling up historical negative gods is no longer fashionable or persuasive, and such extremes lose their ring of acceptable validity. Responsibility replaces sin, ethics replace vindictive moralizing, and understanding replaces condemnation. Such terms as good and bad become relative, and increasingly context is defined and appreciated as a contributing factor. Social sanity begins to replace hysteria, and the propaganda of hate is not so easily sold to the populace. Although this progression of consciousness now prevails in much of the Western world, it is still resisted by areas of the globe where the old gods prevail. There, the religious wars and their political adherents continue to distort spiritual truth and propagate human conflagration and war. Most interestingly, the veil of ignorance that clouds such cultures is now being pierced by the electronic communication media that obliterates political boundaries. Who thought that evil would eventually lose its grip via the transistor chip? The message of truth and freedom is now freely available to almost everyone. Tyranny fails beneath the onslaught of the internet. Information is now the mightiest tool invented since Gutenberg invented the printing press. Via free communication, all mankind is at least coalesced and united in an emerging freedom and brotherhood. The different tongues that have separated mankind into conflicting divisions are now uniting in a shared language that even children readily comprehend. The emergence of a new paradigm of reality was also reflected in the rather spontaneous recent demise of totalitarian aesthetic communism in the former USSR and Eastern Europe. Its decline in the rest of the world is also inevitable and guaranteed by free communication, as well as economic necessity. Communism in the USSR fell without a shot. It was not defeated by a war against evil, but by the emergence of its opposite. Evolution is not via vanquishing the negative, but through choosing and adhering to the positive. This was also demonstrated by the peaceful realignment of North and South Korea. In the world of science as well, a major shift also was occurring during the latter years of the last century. The previous blindness of science was its limitation to the deterministic materialism of the Newtonian linear paradigm of reality that condemned scientific awareness, causing it to stop at the consciousness level that calibrates at 499. This is the level of Newton, Einstein, Freud, and all the other great thinkers and scientists. Information that was not explicable by integral calculus was ignored as chaotic and outside the realm of scientific investigation. Inasmuch as all life and its intrinsic processes are nonlinear, all such knowledge and reality were far outside the paradigm of what was possible in the view of classical science. All this was profoundly changed with the discovery of chaos theory or nonlinear dynamics, which opened all life for investigation. A bridge appeared to enable understanding between science and spirituality, via the clarity made possible by the calibrated scale of consciousness. Science has decided that unless something was definable and measurable, reality is measurement, it was unreal and imaginary. Thus, science invalidated any serious study or inquiry into the human value of love, compassion, beauty, forgiveness, inspiration, faith, companionship, loyalty, gratitude, hope, and happiness. In other words, all that constitutes the actual core and reality of human existence and motivation. Science is also unable to grasp the significance of the subtle and the intangible. It is, however, the best tool man has had thus far for evaluating and manipulating the physical world. That it has limits is not a defect, but merely defines its range of usefulness. In fact, to know one's limits is a strength, not a weakness. An important element in chaos theory is the discovery of so-called attractor fields. These reveal that behind what appears to be inexplicable, chaotic and random events is actually a hidden energy field whose pattern influences the appearance of stochastic or random data. These patterns are discernible behind what appear to be senseless or incomprehensible occurrences in nature, and include explanations of global and environmental changes and weather patterns, as well as the actual beating of the human heart. The inexplicable remains unpredictable, but it becomes comprehensible. The hierarchical levels of spiritual reality are now verifiable and approachable as previously invisible domains whose importance has been unsuspected. That all of human behaviour and belief is dominated by levels of consciousness of increasing power with their own hidden attractor fields is an understanding that elucidates the underpinnings of the behaviours of mankind throughout history. We know that calibrated level of consciousness of any culture, nation, group, person, or institution reveals a very predictable range of expected attitudes, thoughts, emotions, and mental content. Like flocks of birds that follow an invisible pattern, the behavioural patterns of whole segments of society are open to study and awareness. A given population can only accept the paradigm of reality that is within or not too far outside its own parameter, as denoted by its innate, calibrated field of consciousness. These invisible energy fields extend beyond time and space, and are present everywhere throughout all history, at all times, and for everyone. Like a radio receiver, each person attunes to the thought field of their own level of consciousness. Those in the 300s, for example, reverberate quite differently from those in the 400s. Each level tends to discount the reality of the other level. For instance, at 190, pride is a very powerful motivator, e.g., Hitler's Germany. Pride then becomes a justification as well as the means and the end to self-fulfillment. By contrast, in the 400s, reason, logic, and scientific information prevail. It is not until consciousness reaches the 500s that love and compassion take on any real meaning or reality or basis for behaviours. Conflict between the different levels of the energy fields influences the resulting class troubles and the clashes of society with all its political positions. The pendulum of public opinion tends to swing from one extreme to the other, in which the ruling group tries to eliminate the views of those who differ from its prevailing thought forms and beliefs. At the higher levels, conflict is resolved by understanding, compassion, and comprehension, while at the lower levels, conflict is resolved by strife, persecution, and war. The emergence of mankind out of the darkness and ignorance of the past into the hope and promise of the light has thus far been unrecognized for what it is, and for the profound shift that it really implies. This major shift from 190 to 207 is the most profound and significant event in all of man's history. Characteristically, its occurrence was silent, unspoken, and beyond perception. The possibility of this eventuality as man's destiny was foretold by the appearance in mankind of the great avatars. The infinite power of divinity radiates down through the levels of consciousness like sunlight in the forest. It sustains life. When deprived of the power of light, consciousness reverts to its temporary illusionary substitute called force. Force is limited, whereas power is unlimited. Therefore, the end is certain, as force cannot stand against power. And without the infusion of power, force, by its very nature, expends and extinguishes itself. With the expansion of knowledge to include the non-linear, non-duality of reality, it will become stunningly apparent that the most profound, radically scientific statement that is possible to make is, in fact, Gloria in excelsis Deo. And there we are, that's chapter 5. I hope you enjoyed that. I really enjoyed reading it. I hope to see you again soon. Much love.